All right, let's try that all together now. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right, we back. Welcome back from lunch. Hope you are all well fed. Hope you don't start drifting after some tryptophan and some of the sandwiches. We have really great content ahead of us, so stay here, stay excited. We now have an opportunity for a deep dive with a leader who, during his time in the Biden administration, was at the center of the action on some of the most consequential national security issues. Dr. Colin Kahl is here. We're delighted that he has become a leader in our community as he has recently joined the board of the Truman National Security Project. Please welcome Dr. Kahl to the stage, along with Dr. Katherine Pratt, a 2018 Truman Defense Council member. She's going to moderate the conversation.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to tell a quick joke. Why do ghosts ride elevators? It lifts their spirits. Aaron, this one's for you. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I am very excited today to be interviewing Dr. Kahl. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things, including his time in the administration and now what he does with Stanford. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see everybody.
Excellent. So kicking off, can you talk a little bit about what you did as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy? And do you have any key takeaways or lessons that you learned from this job?
You get a lot of sleep. It's really easy. No, for those who don't speak DoD or haven't spent a lot of time in the funny five-sided building, the Undersecretary for Policy, the easiest way to think about it is you're essentially the National Security Advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So you run a kind of a core organization of about 800 folks. There's another 2,000 folks at various agencies that report to you. It's a budget of about $700 million, which is very small by Pentagon standards and very large by normal people standards. But essentially, you staff the Secretary of Defense on all matters of foreign and defense and national security policy that the department has to weigh in on. You represent the Secretary at the Interagency Deputies Committee that the National Security Council runs. You represent the Secretary abroad and as part of defense diplomacy. And you're just a senior advisor and one of the last people in the room on all the issues that he or she has to contend with. It was a real honor to be able to work with Lloyd Austin, who has been a fantastic Secretary of Defense and someone I knew well from his time when he was in Iraq, and I was spending a lot of time focused on the war there, and then when he was the CENTCOM commander and I was working at the White House during the counter-ISIS campaign and the Iran nuclear deal and a bunch of other things. So I have extraordinary respect for Lloyd Austin. That only grew in working with him. So yeah, I mean, I was there from the spring of 2021 through late last summer. So I was there for the evacuation of Afghanistan. I was there for the lead up and then the ultimate full-scale invasion of by the Russians of Ukraine. I was there for the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan and the temper tantrum that Beijing threw after that. I was there for, speaking of China, for the high-altitude balloon, which was not something I had on my bingo card. So a lot of other things. So like I said, easy, lots of sleep.
Awesome. So I'm taking it that you're now recovering in your job as a professor.
Yes, but I have a 12-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son, so they keep me busy. And like a lot of people who have portfolio approaches, I've managed to sign up for things that add up to way more than 100% of my time. So being busy is bored, but it's not nearly as taxing as the alarm going off at 4:30 every morning and the car dropping you off at 9 p.m. every night.
That's awesome. Okay, so you mentioned Russia, so you were undersecretary in that role, and you led the department's response. What was your biggest lesson that you think the national security space needs to carry forward in future conflicts?
Well, I mean, I'm going to say something controversial, which is that, I was in grad school in New York a year after I defended my dissertation and started my teaching job at the University of Minnesota. 9/11 happened, and 9/11 was obviously an extraordinarily impactful geopolitical event. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a bigger deal. And I think that's largely because it is more indicative of where the world is going. I think 9/11 had an outsized impact on the way in which the United States related to the world. But Al-Qaeda and their ilk were never an existential threat to the United States. They were a significant threat, a threat that we had to take extraordinarily seriously. So that's not the point I'm making. But, other potential great powers, especially those with thousands of nuclear weapons capable of blowing up the world, are an existential challenge to the United States. And I think what the Russian invasion of Ukraine suggested was that if we don't get our act together, the 2030s could look like the 1930s, where you have very large authoritarian states, revisionist actors, that believe that their neighbors are actually part of their own sovereign territory and could go on the march to establish spheres of influence, and that if the free world stands aside and lets that happen and doesn't impose real cost on that aggression, we are going to live in a much more dangerous world that could pose a much greater threat to the United States than was ever the case in the immediate post 9/11 era. So I think that was the biggest lesson, which was, for a long time people talked about the hypothetical situation in which a great power could start a high-intensity conventional war in the current age, but it became much more than hypothetical when the Russians rolled in to Kyiv. And I think suddenly people have started to think about what it could mean for Russia doing similar things elsewhere, what it could mean as it relates to China and their ambitions across the Taiwan Strait or the East China Sea or the South China Sea. And I think, I don't give the Trump administration much credit for much, but I do think that both the 2017 National Security Strategy and the 2018 National Defense Strategy were right to make the pivot to focusing on geopolitical competition with other major powers as a defining feature of the current international system. I think that was the right pivot to make. And I think that our national security strategy and national defense strategy in 2022 actually were a natural evolution from that. So I think the Russian invasion at the end of the day was kind of the exclamation point at the end of that sentence.
Fascinating. So pivoting a little bit, so based on those experiences, you've now come into your current job, and one of the research projects that you're looking at is examining the role of emerging technologies. So you may have seen some of that coming into Ukraine, and now you're looking sort of more forward. What are the kinds of emerging technologies that you are interested in looking at, and how do they apply to national security?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not a technologist. I have a doctorate in political science, but I'm neither a real doctor nor a real scientist. So just keep that in mind with everything that I'm saying. But I do reside in Silicon Valley. I teach at Stanford, which is an engine for a lot of the thinking and the research and the training of the people who are shaping the technological universe that is shaping all of our lives. And at the Defense Department, especially as I oversaw the team that wrote the 2022 National Defense Strategy, we had to think seriously about how emerging and disruptive technologies were intersecting with national security challenges that we were facing and taking those seriously. So I would highlight a couple and maybe talk more intensively about one. So I think there are domains that have been around for a while that have nevertheless become even more central, and I would put cyber and space in those categories. The American way of war runs through cyberspace, but it also relies on critical infrastructure that is connected to the internet and not completely secured. And I'm sure you've seen all of the stories about the possibility of what China may or may not be doing to hold that infrastructure at risk. And then, of course, the American way of war also runs through outer space, which is essential for our navigation, for our intelligence, for our surveillance, for our reconnaissance, for our targeting. Literally, the United States could not fight wars in the way that we fight them without our ability to rely on space as a domain. And the Russians and the Chinese know that, which is why they have worked overtime to hold that domain at risk. And as we looked at the National Defense Strategy and the theory of victory that China might have over the United States in particular, we know that they intend to try to paralyze the networks upon which the American way of war depends. So cyber and space have been around for a long time, but they are more important than ever. And I think that's why the department has invested, I think, 11 or 12 billion dollars a year over the last couple of years during the Biden administration on cyber, and close to $30 billion a year on space, which is bigger than most defense budgets of most countries, and it's just for outer space. So these are big deals. In terms of the emerging technologies, I would identify three: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology. All of them, especially AI and biotechnology, are essentially general purpose technologies that have enormous national security implications, but also will just affect everything. And quantum is close. Maybe just say a few things about artificial intelligence, which I think obviously, I'm sure all of you are paying a lot of attention to, but it's probably the technology that the department needs to get its arms around the most. Artificial intelligence is not just like one thing. Okay, it's a whole host of methodologies, different approaches, but I think you can. And the way that I think of it as not a real doctor, not a real scientist, is what are the general use cases for artificial intelligence? And I think there are basically four. One is what I would call classification models. So AI algorithms that are able to identify things. Pictures of cats, pictures of Russian tanks, pictures of dogs, pictures of Chinese amphibious landing vehicles. Enormous ability to use machine vision algorithms and other methodologies to classify things that we pick up from all sources of our intelligence and really get a much more refined picture of what is going on. So these classification models are really important. A second category are what I would call kind of pattern recognition and predictive analytic models, which really are how do you get AI to connect a lot of needles in the haystack to give you a picture in real time of what is going on. And for military purposes, that really is about creating what the military sometimes calls a single pane of glass, of really connecting all the dots so that you have a common operating picture and a common intelligence picture. But predictive analytics matter for more than that too. They matter for predictive maintenance. They matter for the healthcare of our men and women in the armed services. They can help you with training. They can help you with logistics. There are a whole bunch of ways in which big data analytics, predictive analytics can be useful. A third category is generative AI, multimodal generative AI, and I think that obviously, I'm sure you all have played around with ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or Llama or one of these other large language models. They are increasingly multimodal, which means they don't just do text. They do sound. They do video. They do pictures. And what is novel about generative AI is that it generates novel content. So it's not just making predictions about what exists. It takes what the model understands and generates novel content. I think what is revolutionary about generative AI for the national security enterprise is a couple things. One is just how it smooths the human-machine interface. I think one of the things that's remarkable about LLMs is that it interacts through language, which means you can talk to it and write to it in the way that you would talk or write to a human being and get answers back. Now, those answers may be more or less useful. They may be more or less accurate. They are becoming more useful and more accurate over time. But your ability to interface with it is much easier than having to know how to interact with a particular program or let alone know how to code or anything else. So it just smooths the interface with AI, but it also allows you, to increasingly generate things that are useful. So if you are an intelligence officer or an action officer or a computer programmer, it generates things that can be integrated into your workflow in ways that are, potentially making you superhuman. Over time, these models will be, I think, the leading edge of essentially AI assistants and advisors that will co-pilot alongside commanders, soldiers, intel, and analysts on almost everything that they do. I think the countries that do best in the world will be able to partner human beings with these algorithms to make human beings superhuman, not the machines superhuman. And I actually have more confidence that the United States will be able to do that than just about anywhere else. And then the last category of these models is autonomy, and that is models that are basically, once initiated, are making decisions and taking actions on their own. This can be done in virtual realms like automated cyber defense or automated cyber offense. It can be done in the space domain to keep large proliferated constellations in low Earth orbit, resilient in the face of attacks or assaults. But it can also be done in the physical domain. The Pentagon's Replicator Initiative, for example, envisions large swarms of attritable loitering munitions and drones being essential to deterring and, if necessary, defeating a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, for example. So I think these are just some of the areas in which it's impossible to think about national security without technology. And I will make one bold prediction. We are on the eve of an election. Obviously, there will either be a Biden 2.0 or a Trump 2.0. Whether it's Biden 2.0 or Trump 2.0, I will predict that something that we will consider to be artificial general intelligence emerges on the next president's watch. And so if we do not get ourselves ready for that, we're in trouble.
Fascinating. We will have to reconvene at next year's TruCon and see how that goes.
Well, I didn't say next year. I said in the next. In the next 4 years.
Okay, next 4 years. Also, thank you very much for the inadvertent shout out to Copilot TM in your remarks there. But I want to go back to AI there, because a lot of what we're talking about is very future looking. So Gen AI, autonomy, things like that. But a lot of organizations and agencies are looking to incorporate it now. So looking at how can we do contract writing, or the State Department looking at how we can do automated translations. And I would venture that a lot of folks would say that generative AI and ChatGPT and all these models are sort of in their infancy. And as we've seen in the recent week with Google AI, there's a lot of ways that these kinds of things can go wrong. And do you think this kind of technology is sort of operationally ready to take on the nuance that's needed in a lot of these national security spaces? Or how much more work do we need so that it can understand, or humans can understand, what the limits are for things like nuance or commander's intent?
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on is it ready for what, right? So would I trust an AI agent now to provide me recommendations that I didn't double check on what targets, whether those targets were real, whether those targets were viable, whether those targets were legal? No. But do I think the inputs or the suggestions it makes could be valuable and speed up the decision-making process? Yes. I think the question becomes, and this has been some of the reporting and controversy around the Israeli use of AI, for example, is whether it speeds up the targeting cycle so fast that human beings just don't pay enough attention, and therefore you end up doing things that you shouldn't. But that's a human mistake. That's not the problem of the technology. That's completely within the control of human beings. So look, in the national security enterprise, we need to keep the threshold for human beings being involved in decisions very high, because the consequences of failure are high, but also because we have a long tradition in our civilization of holding human beings responsible for the uses of force. And therefore, human beings need to be responsible for the uses of force. So whether it's in the loop or on the loop, there needs to be responsible levels of human judgment on everything. And that's true if you're a fighter pilot. It's also true if you're an action officer writing a memo for the Secretary of Defense. So I do not think everything is ready for prime time, but I think in some areas it's getting increasingly close. I'll give you one, and it's going to sound totally banal, but when I ran OSD policy, we had a lot of people, but never nearly enough for all the work that needed to be done. Okay, so crisis of the day, the evacuation of Afghanistan. We know it's 8 o'clock in the morning. A call just landed at 1 o'clock in the afternoon for the secretary to call the Crown Prince of Bahrain to ask for facilities access so that we could get Afghan evacuees to Bahrain because things were filling up in Qatar. That's not hypothetical. That's a real example of what we're doing. All right. How does this actually get done? Well, there's some action officer who sits in the Middle East office who pulls up the files of the last few times that you called the Crown Prince, updates them based on the knowledge that they know, on the cables, on the intel traffic, tailors talking points based on what the ask is. And look, if you get an 8 o'clock to 1 o'clock, you're going to be hard pressed to get a good a good product done, especially because it's got to go up through the deputy assistant secretary and the assistant secretary and then the undersecretary before going to the front office, and they want some time so the secretary can actually look at it. Like, now you can start to think as if that human beings, this is hard. Where I do think that large language models, if they were fine-tuned on the data that already exists on classified networks, and you could do that securely, is that memo that would take 3 or 4 hours can be done in 30 or 40 seconds to about the 70 or 80% good enough level. And so think about that. So you essentially say that means between 8 o'clock and 8:01, you've generated the 70% solution, and you can spend from 8:01 until whenever it's due to whatever front office fine-tuning it with human, with human knowledge and whatever. That's awesome, right? And that can happen now, right? If we integrate it into our workflows. Now, obviously, if you are, if you're a cyber warrior at Cybercom, you're going to be careful about what you do, co-piloting running code. If you're a targeteer at the KAOC in Qatar, you're going to be careful about recommendations on targeting lists and all the rest. And the more consequential the action, the more the level of human judgment needs to be pretty heavy. But I think we are getting to a place where, at least from an efficiency standpoint, there are lots of work streams that can be sped up right now.
That's a fantastic example. So I'll have one more question, then we'll open the floor, because I'm sure there are folks who have questions as well. So I love how you say you're not a doctor and not a scientist. I am also not a doctor, but I am a technologist, and I also have played in the policy space. And so you've lived in D.C., you currently work for Stanford, and I live in Washington, and I spend a fair amount of time in D.C. And there's this gap between technologists and policymakers, and that tech is mostly built sort of on the West Coast, and policy is written here in DC. How do you think the two can work better to build tech that is policy driven, or tech that is informed by policy? Because it seems like a lot of the problems we have are that, tech is done over here and all of a sudden it doesn't keep up with the policy, or the policy is behind the tech, and we end up in this endless loop of just sort of conflict between the two.
Yeah, look, there are a million challenges. I will just point to two. They're probably pretty obvious. One is there's just an enormous knowledge gap, both in the sense that things are developing so quickly that even if you live in the West Coast technology ecosystem, it's hard to keep up. Even if that's your full-time job and you're trained in it, it's impossible for people in Washington to keep up with the information at the speed of relevance. That also leads to a sense, I think, on the West Coast that people in Washington are ignorant about this stuff, which does not contribute always to positive interactions. I think there are profound culture differences. The world out on the West Coast is a much more risk-taking, gambling world. You've probably heard the example, if you run a venture fund and you fund 10 projects and 9 of them fail catastrophically and one of them is a unicorn, like, you're a superstar and you will raise money for that next fund. If you are at DOD and you have 9 major projects and 10 major projects and 1 out of the 10 fail, or 2 out of the 10 fail, you're going to jail. Okay, and that's a big difference. And so I think that the kind of move fast and break things means very different things if you're sitting, in Palo Alto or at the Pentagon. So I do think there's a culture difference. There are other culture differences too, in the sense that for a long time I think there was a real allergy in Silicon Valley to working with the national security enterprise. You'll undoubtedly recall several years ago the controversy over Project Maven, which, by the way, Project Maven is now operating in places like EUCOM and CENTCOM in the current conflicts, in real time, to help those combatant commands contend with those conflicts. So this is going forward, but you'll recall thousands of people at Google, objecting to Google's working with the Defense Department on these types of AI models. I think that has fundamentally changed, and I think it's fundamentally changed in part because events of the world have changed, and events like the Russian invasion of Ukraine have, I think, woken up people who thought maybe that they didn't care about national security, but increasingly understand that national security cares about them. I think also just the reality of the consensus around the technology competition with China and what that means in terms of export controls and investment screening and outbound investment restrictions means that if you're in tech and finance, you can't ignore the China problem because it will destroy your business if you do. And so I think the world's becoming more dangerous. The business climate is having to adjust to geopolitical competition, and that just means that there are more companies that are open to working with the U.S. government on these issues, and I think that's super important. And not just, I mean, we talked a lot about AI, but in other critical domains too. I mean, whatever one thinks of Elon Musk and SpaceX, the reality is that the future of space is commercial space, and if the United States is going to create resilient space architectures, it won't be by putting up multi-billion-dollar satellites that live in orbit for 30 years that are big, fat, juicy targets for on-orbit and ground-to-orbit anti-satellite weapons, but small, cheap satellites in proliferated constellations, in LEO for sure, increasingly in GEO. And we're going to rely on the commercial sector to build those satellites and to do that launch. And that's why Space Force has kind of gone all in on commercial space. And it's really important for the resiliency of our space architecture. And we saw in Ukraine how important Starlink was to the resiliency of their ability to communicate on the battlefield. So that's all just to say that we are at this moment where tech is waking up to national security and national security is waking up to tech. And I think that's, it's not going fast enough, but it's in a lot better shape than it was, say, 5 years ago.
That's fantastic. Okay, do we have any questions from the floor? I see people moving towards mics. Excellent. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Susan Markham. I'm from this year's class. And I wanted to find out how you think about issues of gender when you're doing policy analysis.
Well, the first thing is to make sure that that you have gender diversity of the folks who are providing you advice and expertise. But I would cast it much more widely than gender diversity. You just need a diversity of a set of experiences. Because if you have a homogeneous set of staff and advisors, you will get an increasingly homogeneous set of advice, and that's not useful as we go about doing things. One of the things I'm proudest about the history of Truman is how instrumental it's been in training an entire generation, now 2 generations, of women national security professionals who are all over the current administration. I mean, when we were doing the Pentagon transition between Trump and Biden, I think 60% of our transition team were women. And as I was looking for deputy assistant secretaries and assistant secretaries, it was never a challenge to find extraordinary qualified women to put on slates. It could be a challenge, more challenging, along other diversity dimensions where I think, again, our community can do better. But I think it's absolutely important. I also think that we need to think about the gender dynamics of conflict. And I do think that one of the things I'm proudest of as undersecretary was the work we did for the secretary on the civilian harm mitigation efforts, which is really about getting our military not just to be compliant in the letter and spirit of the laws of armed conflict, but think about the impact that military activities have on civilian populations, to include the gendered impacts that manifest, especially since, when we talk about quote unquote innocent civilians being harmed in war zones, those are disproportionately women. And so I don't think you can understand either on the input side in terms of good advice or on the output side about what the impact we're having on the world without factoring this stuff in. Thanks.
Awesome. Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Kahl. My name is Jen Cannon. And as the previous role you were in, how did you balance the sometimes more aggressive rhetoric against our strategic competitors with the balanced, peaceful, prosperous rhetoric sometimes that you needed to provide to the greater community, the greater United States and the world? So, for example, when some secretaries would say, China, 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 or other military members would be more aggressive on our strategic competitors, how did you provide that policy guidance to balance that?
Yeah, I mean, my own view is that it needs to be driven by information, not ideological priors. I think one of the ways in which I think we usefully improved on the 2018 National Defense Strategy and the 2022 National Defense Strategy was distinguishing Russia and China from one another. Now, it's true that Russia and China are increasingly aligned with one another, but they are not the same types of challenges to the United States. So the National Defense Strategy defines China as the Pentagon's pacing challenge. The National Security Strategy, Biden's National Security Strategy, defines them as our most consequential strategic competitor. Challenge and competitor are important words in those. And, pacing and most consequential reflect the fact that China is the only country in the world that has the military, economic, diplomatic, and technological capacity to challenge the United States, and increasingly the intention to displace the United States as the world's most influential actor and to rewire the world that we helped architect after the Second World War in a way that would make the world safe for autocracy. So it's a big challenge. But a war with China is neither inevitable nor desirable. And so we have to measure everything that we do against the risk that even while being realistic about the challenge, we don't create a self-fulfilling prophecy to a conflict that would be disastrous for the United States, for China, and for the world. And that was the constant balancing act on the China issue, because I do think there are places in the Pentagon, certainly lots of places in DC, where the Cold War rhetoric is dialed to 11 in a way that goes beyond just the facts to creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's been a lot of attention around the article by Mike Gallagher and Matthew Pottinger in the Foreign Affairs on China. If you haven't read it, you should, because I think it's an illustration of one of these potential self-fulfilling ways to portray it. We have to take China seriously, but we shouldn't treat conflict as inevitable, or we're going to make conflict inevitable. And our job was to deter that conflict and to create guardrails against inadvertently slipping into one, even as we competed with them every single day. That's not how we describe Russia. All right? Russia is described in both the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy as an acute threat. And again, both those terms are important. Acute means immediate and sharp, and threat means threat. So unlike China, Russia cannot dominate the world, but they can blow up the world. And Putin's invasion of Ukraine demonstrates a degree of brazen aggression that we haven't seen by a great power in a very, very long time, hence my 2030s, 1930s reference earlier. So in the case of Russia, like, in a sense, calling a spade is not, like, I don't worry about the self-fulfilling dynamics. You still have to manage the escalation risks and the strategic stability imperatives with Russia, just like we did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but I'm not worried about hurting Russia's feelings very much.
Awesome. Thank you. So I have a very angry red blinker up here telling me that we are out of time. Thank you so much. This was fantastic.